virtual education program. My name is Beth, and I am one of our coordinators of education support and outreach here at the Alzheimer's Society. During the COVID times, we're not offering any face-to-face programming. Instead, we're using this Zoom platform to stay connected with you. Please feel free to ask questions using the private and confidential chat box addressed to the Alzheimer's Society of Nova Scotia host. If you don't see it, you can use your mouse to hover near the bottom, and there should be a chat in the middle. And if you click on that, it should pop up for you. Also, Claire is going to send a little reminder that this is how you use the chat box, and it should pop up for you, and you can type your questions in there. And remember to press enter afterwards so it actually comes to us. Your questions and comments in the chat box will only be seen by the Alzheimer's Society, and we will get to the questions at the end of the presentation. For the best viewing, we suggest using the speaker view, which you can see at the top right-hand corner of your screen if you're on a computer. If you see speaker view, you can click on it, and it should make whomever is speaking the largest picture on your screen. Our audience today includes people living with dementia, people caring for someone with dementia, and people who just want to learn more. So just another reminder that this session is being recorded. Your microphones and videos have been turned off, so your faces and voices will not be part of this recording. Today's topic is weighing risk and autonomy in daily living. We'll have a 20 to 30 minute presentation, followed by 10 to 20 minutes of questions and answers. So it is my pleasure to welcome Catherine Ann Murray, who is an occupational therapist with Nova Scotia Health. She works with the Memory Clinic team in Geriatrics in Halifax. She has completed the certificate program in dementia studies at the University of Stirling in Scotland. Her passion is to support people living with dementia, their partners in care, and to continue safely living at home and in the community for as long as possible. So welcome, Catherine Ann.
Thank you, Beth. Thanks for having me. So I'm going to dive right in because there's a lot of information I want to share and hopefully get lots of time for questions. So bear with me, this is my first Zoom presentation, so it's a new experience, but I think we have it all set up the right way. So this topic, the topic of weighing risks with autonomy in daily living, comes up often in our work in geriatrics and our work and experience working with people living with dementia and their partners in care or caregivers. So a big question we see a lot is how can we uphold the person's right to take meaningful risks in their day-to-day life in the context of having dementia, while also supporting caregivers. So we try to approach risk in a positive problem-solving way, with the knowledge that no one can really be 100% safe 100% of the time. And if they are, they may not be living their best life, or maybe some of their autonomy and independence have been removed unnecessarily or too soon. So we see that, a safety-first approach can actually be disempowering for people living with dementia. And so I'm hoping this presentation will shed a little bit more light on this very gray zone topic. So the objectives will be, I'm going to briefly describe autonomy and risk within the context of older adults and dementia care. I'm going to identify areas of daily living that risks often arise for people living with dementia, and we'll review 3 areas of daily living and offer strategies to preserve autonomy while lowering risks. So the 3 areas we're going to focus on are wandering or exploring, medication management, and incontinence and toileting. So I'm going to focus on examples from the community. We're not going to talk about risks that often come up in a long-term care setting. That can easily be a whole other presentation. I'm going to focus on risks that often come up while still living alone at home and or with a caregiver or other partners in care involved at home. So what is autonomy? So autonomy is often viewed as a basic right in Western societies. It's the ability to make decisions, however great or small, based on your own values, preferences, and ways of living your life. It's also considered to have self-determination. So it's to be able to be independent in any task in a fashion that makes sense to you. and in a way that you prefer to do it. So whether that be walking, using the bathroom, making a meal, or engaging in leisure activities. It also means to choose who you like to spend time with or engage with. However, we know that with dementia, keeping your autonomy and own ways of doing things can be more difficult as the disease progresses. Eventually, you're going to have outside influences like caregivers or partners in care and healthcare professionals that will be required, and an increasing level of support and intervention. So then we introduce the notion of relational autonomy. So really the person's ability to express their autonomy and independence will largely depend on whether caregivers or partners in care or healthcare professionals involved will be able to or feel they want to be able to support your autonomy. So the concept of risk and rights and autonomy is a growing one in older adults and dementia care. So especially as we start to view dementia with more of a disability rights lens. So the Alzheimer's Society Canadian Charter of Rights for People with Dementia highlights the importance of respecting dignity and choice, as does the Canadian National Strategy for Dementia, while also recognizing the important role of caregivers. The dignity of risk is a concept that was originally used in the care of adults with intellectual disabilities, but now it's being applied and used more widely used globally in dementia care and older adult care. So if you have any experience, either as a person living with dementia, a partner in care, or a healthcare professional, you may notice that differences in tolerance for risk can cause some friction and disagreement. So the person with dementia, in my experience, they almost always have a high level of risk tolerance. They want to maintain their independence as long as possible, even if it means some risks are involved. Often, though, dementia can cause a lack of insight, so the person may not be aware of the potential negative consequences of their decision or actions, and they may lack insight into some of the care that they need. But this doesn't mean we can't try to problem solve with them and their partners in care how to keep as much independence as possible while still lowering the risks involved. Caregivers can have a wide range of comfort level for risk. So this may depend on their level of stress, how supported they feel in taking risks with the person living with dementia, their sense of competency and coping as a caregiver, and it may depend on their own experiences with similar situations or their own personal values on risk-taking. Healthcare professionals will vary in their risk tolerance as well. So along with caregivers, they may be influenced by personal or professional values around risk and how they view preserving independence. The three other factors that often come up and are much more subtle, but they do impact the way we treat and interact with older adults that's ageism. So ageism tend to make us more risk averse. So we shy away from risk when we're ageist. Paternalism, so thinking that we are responsible for any negative outcome that may happen to a person. And then the fear of liability is a big one too. So those three factors, again, a different presentation, but they can all contribute to feeling or taking actions that are more risk averse at the expense of maybe removing autonomy. So we see that the degree to which a person living with dementia may be supported in their autonomy can depend on the risk tolerance of others in their world. So where do we start? So in terms of identifying and assessing risk, basically you want to look at all the different daily activities the person may or are likely going to be doing. And so here are common daily activities that we often see risks arise for people living with dementia. So we have obviously the falls and the decreased mobility are big ones. And whenever we have a risk of falls, there's always going to be the risk of injury and then the severity of the injury, risks within bathing, the kitchen safety, medication management, spending time home alone, incontinence, toileting, wandering, smoking, meals. Are they eating enough food? Are they losing weight at a particularly fast rate that's not normal or typical? Are we worried about them eating raw food or uncooked food? And then driving is a big topic. And then also there's always the risk of stress the partners in care involved, and also the caregiver's own health and situation. So in some situations, the caregiver also has dementia, and so that can make the assessing of risk and problem solving that much more complex. Or they have their own multiple health conditions that can make it more difficult for them to be a caregiver for the person with dementia. So there's a lot of areas of risk that can be assessed and problem solved around. And you may only need to target one or all of them at one point, but every situation is going to be different. So a big point with this whole approach around risk taking is to look at it from a perspective from how do I take the least restrictive approach. So one way to preserve autonomy is to think, what is the least restrictive approach required that will still lower some risks? A basic example of that is a bathing scenario. So if a person is having more difficulty stepping in and out of the tub, obviously risk of falls and injury, but they still really want to shower. So the most restrictive approach would be to remove this activity from them altogether. Sorry, it's too risky. You need to start sponge bathing. And maybe this is an eventual solution, a solution for some people, but a least restrictive approach to try first, maybe to set up the tub shower with equipment and adaptive aids so that you can enable the person to continue this task that they enjoy without removing it altogether. So you can start with a least restrictive approach for all of these common activities and only increase the intervention of supports when absolutely needed. So we don't want to remove independence too soon or if we don't need to. And for partners in care, sometimes they don't know what exists in terms of assistive technology, adaptive aids, or resources that could allow them to take on more of a risk-tolerant approach with the person with dementia. So sometimes education about dementia, how to set up the environment, or how to modify these tasks can help them see how the person could stay independent longer. Okay. Just want to make sure, okay. Okay, so let's jump into wandering. So I chose wandering as an example because it can be a risky activity that often comes up for people living at home. And it's so easy to jump to the worst case scenario such that we often think we can't enable people to explore or walk outside the home on their own. So first of all, the words wandering, elopement, exit seeking, they're all medicalized terms rather than truly person-centered terms. So from the perspective of the person living with dementia, often they're simply exploring their environment, going on a meaningful journey or enjoying a walk. So changing our language can help change the way we approach this meaningful activity right from the start. So how do we identify and assess risk with wandering? So here are a few starting points and questions that we want to ask. Is there evidence of wandering, or is it a fear or a what if? So not everyone with dementia will wander or want to initiate leaving the house. Some people do, some people don't. But we really want to make sure that we ask the questions first about what is the evidence of wandering before we catastrophize or jump to, oh, they're going to start wandering, we need to lock them in the house. So things we're looking at is, does the person say they're going to leave, but maybe they don't actually initiate opening the door or leaving. I'm just jumping here a bit. So we're also looking at the frequency. If they do leave the house, how often do they leave? Do they leave every day? Or do they leave a few times a day? So the risk is going to be higher if they're leaving more often during the day. If they only leave once a day or a couple times a week, the risks are going to be lower. I'm just going to check the chat here because I feel like, I see. Okay, thanks, Beth. Okay. Okay, so another question we can ask is there a particular time of day they feel they need to leave the house? Or does it seem random? So if there's a pattern in the time of day they want to leave the house or they leave the house, and this can offer a clue for a care plan to target towards. So this is good information to know. You're asking, does the wandering happen at night? Obviously, the risks are higher if the person's leaving their home at night versus during longer hours during the day. Is the wandering purposeful? So it may appear the person is walking aimlessly, but in fact, maybe they're checking on their flowers in the garden or around the house. do they have a strong desire to leave the home because maybe they had a daily routine of leaving the home in the past? So maybe they always took the dog for a walk every morning. And so this pattern has carried over to give them that sense of, okay, I need to leave this morning, even if the dog isn't there anymore. It could be carried over from before. And obviously risk will depend on whether they live on a quiet cul-de-sac versus a downtown intersection with lots of traffic lights and busy two-way lanes. Then you're asking, does the person still have the ability to judge the weather and dress accordingly? Or would they leave their home in the winter with only pajamas on? And obviously winter time is likely going to pose more risks than maybe if the person's leaving their home during the summer. Another big question we want to find out is the person living with dementia able to return home on their own? And have they actually been given the chance to try this? So often people living with dementia can still use physical landmarks like a church or a large tree in their familiar environment to help with wayfinding, even though when you ask them where they live, they may not be able to tell you what street they live on or how to get there, but they're using landmarks within their environment and they still have that capability often. So another question you may consider, if they do need redirection from a partner in care, will they agree? Are they easily redirectable, or will it trigger a responsive behavior agitation? I'm thinking this is in more moderate to severe stages dementia, where you may have to consider if wandering is happening within the home and there's risks of wandering within the home, then you're looking at how easily redirectable are they. Let's say at nighttime if they're getting up to come back to bed, and that may warrant a more restrictive approach like placing a lock on the door. So your intervention and how restrictive you are is always going to depend on how well you've identified and assessed the risks involved. And so all of these questions around wandering are going to give you a better sense of what the risks are and how high or how high the level of risk is. So here are a few strategies. Now that we've assessed the risk, or we've asked questions to identify and assess the risk, there are some solutions or problem-solving strategies that you can use to still preserve autonomy and take a least restrictive approach. So there's GPS technology on the market that can be used so that the person can continue to come and go from their home as they please, but a partner in care has access via a phone to see where they are at any given time. Safely Home Bracelet is another option. This is a least restrictive approach. There is no GPS feature, but if the person is wearing it and someone in the community notices they're wearing it and the person seems lost or confused, that person can use the identification number on their bracelet to help them find their way home. The Alzheimer's Society is a great resource to call about these strategies and these items. You may consider talking to your neighbors about the person that you're helping, the person with dementia that you're helping with. Just to lower the risk, you may say, you know, so-and-so tends to leave the house around 9 a.m. every morning, but so far they seem to always come home. But just keep an eye out if you don't mind. And so a little extra supervision is going to lower the risk as well. So within the home, if you have a caregiver in the home as well, you may consider putting up door sensor technology to alert the caregiver if the person initiates leaving the home. A more restrictive approach, maybe more in the severe stages of dementia that may be needed, is if you do actually need to put a lock on the inside of the door, you can get locks that blend in well with the door. So the person with dementia, they may try to open it, they realize it's not an option to open, and they continue on their way. So medication management is another task that has obvious risks attached to it if it's not completed correctly, or there's errors in memory and forgetting to take meds. So again, frequency is a big one for deciding how much risk is involved. So if the person's only taking meds once a day and they're missing 1 to 2 days per week of their meds, that's going to be probably less risky than if they're taking meds 4 times a day and missing all of those 4 meds 1 to 2 days a week. So you're looking at the frequency of how often do they need to take the meds. You're looking at the types of meds. So for example, if they're taking a vitamin, forgetting to take a vitamin here and there is going to be less risky than maybe taking a very important blood pressure pill. So there may not be a need to intervene yet if they're just forgetting to take a few vitamins. This is a conversation you want to be able to have with a physician to help you talk about the risks of forgetting vitamins versus the risks of forgetting a couple of blood pressure pills. So the method of storage can introduce risk. So trying to organize and keep track of pill vials often introduces more risk of missing and mixing up meds compared to having them organized in a weekly DOS set or blister pack. So that's a way to preserve independence, is to simplify the task. We'll get to that in a minute. And then you want evidence of how often is the person actually missing their meds. Do they tend to miss their lunchtime pills more than morning pills? Are they forgetting to take 5 to 7 days worth of meds, or maybe 1 to 2 days every week? And what does that mean for the risk, depending on the pills they're taking? Are they taking all the pills from each bubble or each container from the DOS set, or are they leaving some behind? So those answers will help you assess the risk as well. Insulin management often requires more thinking skills, judgment, and problem solving in the moment. So for example, when the person checks their blood sugars, will they know how to act accordingly to the reading? Do they understand what to do if they have low sugars or high sugars? Do they understand what the normal range should be? So the consequences of mismanagement of insulin can lead to some high risks, like a hypo or hyperglycemic episode, where you can have more confusion and falls. So there are risks with that in particular. And then in geriatrics, we often see older adults that are maybe on too many medications. So there's a risk for delirium and or falls. Those can be higher risks with polypharmacy. So maybe a good solid medication review by a physician or a geriatrician could lower the risks of being on too many meds. So strategies to lower risk around meds and to preserve autonomy here. Is it possible to lower the frequency? So can meds be taken once a day rather than 2 or 3 times? This is something we often do, our geriatricians do in the clinic, is to make recommendations to the family doctor about bringing that blister pack or that frequency of meds from 3 times a day to maybe 1 or 2 times. It just simplifies it, makes it easier, and can preserve that independence. So that you want to talk about with a physician. And you may also consider, is there a task that the person living with dementia can pair it with that you know they do every day, like taking a glass of orange juice or brushing their teeth, so that you can place the medications next to that associated task, and maybe that might help them generate a routine of being independent to take those meds in the morning. Some education might be helpful. So again, clarify with a pharmacist or physician whether, maybe it's not a big deal if they're forgetting a few vitamins every week. Maybe there's no need to intervene at that point yet. You're looking at maybe assistive technology can offer a reminder or a cue to take the pills rather than rely on a caregiver. So, or if the meds are placed within view, maybe on a kitchen counter, a bathroom counter, or next to something, again, that we know the person uses every day, then you've introduced that visual cue or that association cue. So all of these strategies, again, are towards the goal of enabling that independence and avoiding having to involve a caregiver or a heavy level of caregiving as long as possible. And again, to be least restrictive to the person's sense of dignity and autonomy. And then you're looking at, can the pills can be stored in a DOS set or a blister pack? So again, you're simplifying the task to remove some of the thinking skills required. And then a good thing to do if they are on insulin and need more complex management in this area, then talk with a doctor or a nurse about options to simplify this piece of medication management. Okay, we're going to jump into toileting and incontinence. And how do we assess this? So I get excited about talking about toileting, but it's mainly because there are so many ways that people can maintain their dignity and autonomy and independence in this task longer than I think people think, if they just know the right strategies and the ways to set things up. So things you're looking at with risks with toileting is the pathway from where they are, let's say in the living room or the bedroom, clear to be able to walk to the bathroom without tripping? Can the person see the toilet and where the bathroom is from where they are or soon after they get up? So obviously we want to lower any risks for falls during this task as much as possible. So getting on and off the toilet while also trying to hang on to your clothes and do everything that you need to do within that task, it can really throw someone's balance off. And this is true if the caregiver is involved as well. So the caregiver could also be at risk of a fall or injury as they're trying to help. So incontinence is a big risk with toileting, especially in more the moderate and severe stages of dementia. And incontinence can be often a breaking point for caregivers, especially if bowel incontinence is involved, and understandably so. So if there are ways to problem solve around this to either lower the frequency of incontinence or optimize independence, we're trying to look at that as much as possible. So again, so the person living with dementia can preserve dignity as long as possible, and the caregiver hopefully doesn't have to be as involved as much. So we're looking at ways, you know, if there's a trained professional that can help with this incontinence, that's going to alleviate some caregiver stress. For the incontinence piece. So strategies to lower and preserve autonomy with toileting. So the first and foremost, you want to ask, is there a cause of incontinence that can be reversed? And that's again a discussion with a doctor that, you know, the person may be on certain medications like diuretics that can increase risk of incontinence or make them need to go to the washroom more often. So is that something that can be discussed with a doctor to weigh out the pros and cons of adjusting certain medications in order to lessen incontinence episodes? So in terms of modifying the environment or non-pharmacological approaches, you may consider asking if a toilet or commode can be closer to the person. So where is the closest bathroom to where they are? Is the toilet within view, so as to help the person to find their way to the bathroom? So often, if you can, depending on the layout of the house, keeping the bathroom door open within a direct line of view of the person can again act as that visual cue. So there's very little decision making involved in between standing up and looking for the bathroom, if that is actually an issue for the person. You can also consider placing a sign on the bathroom door or on the wall next to the bathroom that has both a picture of a toilet and the word or the text toilet on it, so that people living with dementia, if they still have that capability of recognizing what that thing is, they know they can enter that room and find a toilet there. And then a big part of a least restrictive approach is looking at what adaptive aids can be placed on and around the toilet. And we'll get to the next slide in a minute here and talk more about that. So that's really going to help the person be independent with getting on and off the toilet, maintaining their balance while they manage their clothing, and do the things they need to do to complete that task. So adaptive aids can be a big help to people and can, again, take away some of that caregiver assist that people sometimes need, but with the right aids in place, it can actually be removed. And then if continence is inevitable, and we need to be looking at ways to manage it, then you may look at wearing pull-up depends, maybe only at night if the risk for incontinence is higher at night. You may look at the reusable incontinence pads that you can place on a bed or a chair, incontinence mattress covers. So this is really helping to lower the risk for the caregiver stress involved in the cleanup and the management, but again, also maybe offering to prolong some dignity with this task as well for the person living with dementia. Some people with moderate, more severe stages dementia may respond well or may do better with a toileting schedule. So that does require a partner in care, reminding them to go to the bathroom every 2 or 3 hours. But sometimes that can lower the risk of actually having an incontinence episode, and again, preserve the independence to actually use the toilet. So the nighttime toileting, you're looking at ways to set up maybe a commode at the bedside, maybe a urinal. Some people set up motion sensor lights so that if the person's getting up at night to go to the bathroom, they can clearly see where they're going and lower the risk for falls. And then considering what you're wearing on your feet. So whether you're barefoot, wearing slippers, or non-slip socks. And again, the surface of what you're walking on is going to introduce risk or lower risk as well. And then Another piece that we can look at a home care plan or a care plan is to have home care or hired caregivers to assist at times of day that a person may most likely be incontinent, or at least they can help with some of the incontinence personal care during the day, so that that a spouse or an adult child doesn't have to be involved, and that can help preserve that relationship and some dignity for the person living with dementia. And I think we're almost out of time. This is good timing. So here's my glorified slide of toilet equipment. You'll see several different examples here of how the toilet can be set up or modified, again, to preserve independence and lower the risks involved with this task. And again, hopefully take away some of that help that the caregiver may be doing for them. So you've got toilet handles here. You've got another version of toilet handles here. Here you've got the raised height and the toilet handles. A commode is an option. It gives you the flexibility to place it beside the bed at night or place it over the toilet during the day. The legs are adjustable to adjust the height. And then you've got a different setup of grab bars that if you're able to install grab bars, it's good to put them around the toilet. Okay, so fans of the show, Grace and Frankie, will recognize this scene. And I wanted to sneak that in there because it's funny, and it does highlight that, you know, sometimes people have actually found their own ways, their own creative solutions to avoid being stuck on the toilet or to have to rely on someone to help them off the toilet. So that's a good little scene to remind us of that. Okay, I'm going to wrap up here. So certainly during this pandemic, it has caused some challenges for people living with dementia at home and their partners in care. In particular, those living with more severe stages of dementia and their partners in care at home. So as we know, since March, admissions to long-term care facilities from the community have ceased due to concerns about community spread and of COVID. And as far as I know, we don't know when regular community admissions into long-term care are going to restart. So as you can imagine, there were a lot of caregivers and a lot of people with dementia that were expecting to move to long-term care a few months ago, but that wasn't possible. So they've stayed home longer. We know that hospitals are often not the best setting for a person with dementia if there's nothing sort of acutely medically wrong with them. The environment can be chaotic. It can be very unfamiliar with unfamiliar people and routines. And dementia care expertise can be lacking in hospital settings. And then along with the recent challenges of not being able to have a family member or family advocate present while the person living with dementia is in hospital, that's a scenario that we want to try to avoid if at all possible. And so we've asked our caregivers to provide support longer at home already after months to years of providing a high level of care. So we're seeing a high rate of caregiver fatigue and lowered coping these days. Another big program that had to close and that I'm anxiously awaiting any news about is the Adult Day program. So this has meant that people living with dementia who have attended this program for up to 5 days a week are now spending more time with their family at home with their caregivers. So this loss of a dementia-friendly program and respite has been difficult to adjust to for both the person living with dementia and their caregivers. And then you may not have as many family members able to travel into Nova Scotia to help as they may normally have if they live outside the Atlantic provinces or Canada. So certainly we have a new set of challenges that have made staying at home longer more difficult. However, I do think that it's raised a couple of good points in that I think people have been forced to problem solve a little bit more creatively and individually. And we've had to really look at our tolerance for risk. And we may have had to stretch our tolerance for risk a bit more. And we've had to provide more possibility-oriented education to caregivers, more reassurance, more a sense of being there for them if they have questions about dementia or how to support the person with dementia. And I know the Alzheimer's Society has been a big part of that as well through these last few months. And I'll leave it here with the Alzheimer's Society slide for the info line.
Thank you, Catherine Ann. You gave us lots to think about. It was a great presentation. So we do have some questions from some of our viewers. The the first one is from a niece. So my aunt has moderate dementia. She lives alone and she enjoys walking in her neighborhood. What sort of technology is there to help my aunt be more independent and continue to do this safely?
Okay. So there again, if we look at that wandering example, and I'm not even going to say the word wandering because your aunt sounds like she's enjoying going for walks and it's purposeful, and the risk would be if she can safely return home and orient home. So something you may consider is looking into that GPS technology, maybe chatting about it with your aunt. So there are a couple of brand names that you can look into with that GPS technology. There's two catches to be aware of with this kind of thing. The person living with dementia has to be able to have that small gadget on them somehow. So you have to know that it's either going to be in a purse that she'll always take, or somewhere in a coat that you know that she'll always wear when she leaves. So that's one catch that you have to make sure is going to happen. And then some of these GPS technologies, they need to be charged. So I'm not sure how many days in a row they can be used without being charged, but you'll have to have someone that will be able to charge it as well at home. And then that may introduce the difficulty of having to get the gadget from her, charge it, and then putting it back. So there are some things to problem solve with that. But the nice thing about the GPS technology is that it preserves the person's autonomy to come and go as they please. And it still alerts the caregiver whenever the partner in care may want to look up on their phone where the person is. They can tell exactly where they are. There's also a setting you can put in so that the partner in care can be alerted if the person living with dementia is outside of a certain radius, and you can predetermine that radius. So there are some good features with that. It's sort of a win-win. It gives the reassurance to the caregiver and preserves the autonomy for the person.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different varieties. So sometimes it's hard to figure out which one's going to work best for you and your person with dementia. The Alzheimer's Society at our info line, we can help a little bit with that. We can send you some links to some different options, as well as we have some documents on how that can help you figure out what are the options and which one might be best for you and your person with dementia to maintain that independence as long as possible. So we have another question. Catherine Ann, can you explain your approach to families when you explain risk? It's always a challenge to try and navigate this issue, causes great anxiety. And also giving up a bit of the caregiver role can be hard for some of the caregivers.
Yes, yeah. So that's a really good question. It's going to depend. It's going to depend on what in particular the risk is. So, for example, we'll do kitchen safety. We'll do use of the stovetop. So let's say the person living with dementia, they still enjoy cooking a meal on a stovetop once or twice a day. And obviously there might be concerns from the family member about memory to turn the burner off. But maybe there's a bit of evidence about leaving containers on the burner and you've got melted plastic, or you've got the bottom of pots that look like they've been burning. So there is evidence that there's a difficulty there with remembering to turn the burners off. But yet you know how important it is for the person living with dementia to continue to maybe make that bit of tea or make that fried egg. That gives them a great sense of identity, personhood, a sense of still having that autonomy. So I'll actually explain sort of what you have to weigh out the risks of. What is the risk of removing a sense of identity and personhood to that person? So risk of psychosocial or emotional well-being versus the risk of what we often focus on, the risk of fire, the risk of falls, the physical risks that we jump to all the time. So I always validate a caregiver's concern. It's coming from a good spot, and it is legit in terms of, the person living with dementia does have a cognitive disability that is affecting their ability to use the stovetop safely. However, I try to use that language like, what's the least restrictive thing we can do that will lower some of the risk without taking away that activity altogether. So I'll still use that language, and I still might even say, the person has a right to take this risk. We may not agree with it. However, if we look at ways to lower the risk, we're showing that we're putting in reasonable supports so that they can still do this meaningful activity. So for example, the stove. So you may decide to get the technology that the stove will automatically turn off if it hasn't detected motion in a certain amount of time. You may decide to remove 2 or 3 of the knobs corresponding to 2 or 3 of the burners. So then instead of the risk of 4 burners being on, you've only got the risk of 1 burner being on. So there's ways to look at it in terms of lowering the risk, but again, still letting the person engage in an activity that's meaningful to them.
It's a great way to look at it, and it's a very individualized approach because it's different for everybody, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And it's weighing out what's important to you. And sometimes caregivers also hear from other family members who may think that they should be doing more to protect mom or dad. And so some of those conversations can be really difficult too.
Yes. Yeah. And I think the second part of the question was how, like, some part, and it depends on the personality of the caregiver. Some people just want to overhelp. It just comes naturally to them to jump in. And sometimes it makes sense to jump in and help if it's a time constraint or things need to get done quickly. So in some situations it makes sense. And it's not going to be perfect every time. I think that the most important thing is to start thinking about and talking about risk in a positive way, rather than be so focused on keeping people safe. And that is a language and lingo that I think sometimes our culture can be focused on, rather than talk about, well, what about enabling a positive risk-taking approach? And what can we do so that this person is still living a full life that's meaningful to them, despite having these disabilities? Yeah. So I think the conversation is a good start.
Yeah, that's so true. And it leads nicely into our next question. So this is from someone living with dementia. What if my risk tolerance is higher than my daughter's and I want to live life to the fullest while I still can, but my daughter wants to wrap me in bubble wrap to protect me? How do I talk to her about this?
Yeah, so that's great. It's coming from the lived experience. So the conversation is a great place to start. So I would sit down with the daughter and say, I mean, again, it's going to depend on the person with dementia, their level of insight, and how they appreciate or understand the potential negative risks that could happen. But that person, so you may say, listen, this is what I want to do. I want every day at 4 o'clock, this walk to the park or going to the bank or going along the waterfront. These are very important things to me and my sense of well-being, that if I don't continue to do them, the risk of me becoming depressed or isolated or not having a full sense of self is greater in my mind than the risk of people taking advantage of me financially or getting lost or having to be escorted home by the police because maybe they find me looking a bit confused. If you're able to articulate all that, that's great. But I think having a conversation with your partners in care, I mean, even in advance, if you've been diagnosed with early stages dementia, and these are the types of things you're thinking about as your dementia progresses, have these conversations early so that your partners in care will hopefully feel more comfortable in enabling that positive risk-taking when you don't have as much insight or problem-solving abilities if you are on one of these outings. And there's a couple of resources. Maybe I'll share one of the resources that I always turn to. It's called Nothing Ventured, Nothing Gained, Risk Guidance for People with Dementia. So it's a resource from the UK, and it actually provides a graph and tables to talk about, okay, what's the activity, what are the risks, what are ways to mitigate the risk. So again, you're acknowledging the viewpoint of the caregiver, saying, I know that you're concerned, I can see why you'd be concerned of A, B, and C, but here's my perspective. So we can't, again, expect to agree on the risk, but we can try to understand each other's viewpoints and coming up with a plan from there.
Good, thank you. So you mentioned quite a few different adaptive devices. What's the best way to access the equipment that you mentioned? And how do I know if it's right for my person with dementia?
So maybe I'll hop back to, just to prompt us here, back to this slide. Okay, so I mean, this is just the toilet equipment is just one example of all the different types of equipment you can get for toilets. And obviously there's things like bath benches and bath chairs and bed or rails for beds and lift chairs. So most home health sections of stores will carry these items. So these are things like raised toilet seats with arms, toilet safety frame, the commode, also known as the over toilet commode, or specific grab bars that you're able to install beside the toilet or in and around the shower area. So most home health sections will sell this equipment along with medical supply vendors or medical vendor stores. So if you call the Alzheimer's Society, or look at the Yellow Pages or do your own Google search, you'll find a list of different places that do have this equipment. And then the other thing I would keep in mind is that some insurance policies, if you do have insurance, give them a call and see if there's any funding or coverage for adaptive aids or medical equipment, because some insurance policies will cover all or provide partial funding for these things. How do you know whether it's going to work for your wife? It's a good question. I mean, there's so many options. There's a few things to consider. If you have a healthcare professional to help you assess and problem solve through adaptive aids, that's ideal, because they're going to have the experience to know, based on this person's health conditions and their abilities, what equipment is going to be most useful to them to preserve their independence. So if you have a health professional you can access, great. If not, again, you can call the Alzheimer's Society. They may be able to help you problem solve through, okay, do I need a raised toilet seat or do I just need the handles? So something to consider, the raised toilet seat is offering that height, the extra height, to be able to stand easier. So, I mean, if your wife is a short person, she may not need a raised toilet seat, and actually it might be uncomfortable for her because her feet might be dangling, and that's not a fun experience during that task. So if you're a shorter person, you may not need the height, but you may like the railings. If you're a tall person, then definitely you may consider adding the height to make standing easier, and maybe also the handles if your balance isn't as good. So there's different factors you're kind of weighing out.
We also had a comment come through that it also helps to keep the toilet paper accessible.
Yes.
So you don't have to lean way over and risk.
Thank you. Thank you to whoever made that point. I hope I can maybe see them tomorrow at work or something. Yes. Yeah. Very good point. Everything that's needed.
Yeah. So we have time for one more quick question. And so my mother's doctor said that she can't make any personal or medical decisions. So doesn't that mean that I need to make all the decisions for her?
Good question. This is a big area that we work in geriatrics. So just a bit of a background. So people with dementia, as the disease progresses, they can have more difficulty with making decisions because they lose their thinking skills in judgment and problem solving and weighing out different scenarios. So eventually, in the more moderate to later stages, eventually the person may need to have a substitute decision maker or power of attorney involved in making decisions around personal care and finances. However, we can still apply a human rights approach to being involved in decision making, a supportive decision making model, so that person living with dementia, we still want to take a least restrictive approach to infringe on their human rights and decision making as much as possible. So for example, so the person with dementia is not able to, let's say, have insight or understand that they need home care coming in a few times a week. However, they may still be able to make choices about what time they want them there, what tasks they want them there, and there's still a give and take about involving them as much as possible. The other big important part is that we can still work under best interest care principles. So even though the person isn't able to have the insight or appreciate how much care they need or the deficits they have, they can still tell us their values and preferences. They may still be able to tell us, home is important to me. They may not say it in those words, but maybe their behaviors or the words they're using can tell us obviously that being home or doing this task is a very important task. So that doesn't mean that we can't problem solve with them to try to, again, lower their risk. So I think people often think that people with dementia, when they lack capacity for healthcare and financial decisions, they need to be in a nursing home. They're not allowed to be at home. They're unsafe. We work with several people in the community who have been deemed to lack capacity for both healthcare and decision making. Mind you, they have a very individualized, specific care plan, and we're doing a lot of education and collaboration with the decision makers involved. But it certainly is possible, and you can certainly still apply a human rights approach to supporting people in that situation.
Thank you. So I think we'll wrap it up now. Thank you for your very thoughtful answers to the questions. You gave us a lot to think about, and I think what I took away from it is that there are lots of creative solutions out there. So ask for some help. Be creative in the ways that you support your person with dementia to enable them to stay independent as long as possible with whatever tasks that they can and they do enjoy. And there was a quote from somewhere, I'm not sure if you had it on one of your slides or not, but it says, "Don't let what I can do interfere with what I still can do." And I think that's pretty important when we're talking about autonomy and self-directed care, that we think about things like that. So I want to thank everybody for being here today. So if you have any more comments or questions, you can drop them into the chat box. We'll leave that open for a little while. In a few moments, Claire is going to put up a poll question, and we'd appreciate if you answer it before you sign off. We use that feedback to help us develop new and different programs like this. If you would like to have a private and confidential call with one of our InfoLine staff, and actually, Catherine, I'll get you the numbers behind me here, but if Catherine, if you'd advance the slide, you can call us at 1-800-611-6345. And we can help you figure out what might be some creative solutions, or where you can look for different product suggestions and things like that to help your person with dementia stay as independent as possible. So just another reminder that this call was recorded, and we will be hosting it on our ASNS YouTube site, and you can also access it through our website. So you can watch it again, you can share it with family, or even use it as a teaching tool. So again, thank you, and be safe.